There are many stories of company managers being instrumental in uncovering fraud that involved people working at theaters. More recently, there was a famous case in New York in which the performers realized that there were more people in the house than they were being told. And they detected a major fraud, and it was subsequently investigated, I believe, by the Attorney General's office.
Robert Anderson, the man who wrote Tea and Sympathy, who's never written a musical, by the way, but he has a great playwright. We have it almost on the wall as a sampler that someone so the theater's a place where you can make a killing, but you can't make a living. And that's very true. One show, one big hit for the rest of your life, because there is now the life of a musical after Broadway and after the First Class Road is gigantic. There's probably more money in the show from its subsidiary life, that is to say stock, amateur, foreign, all the things that go on afterwards, is every bit as remunerative as the original Broadway production.
So you can make a pretty good living if
you can make a fortune.
Are you a member of a union?
Well, it's almost a union. It's called the Dramatists Guild, which I was president of for 18 years, and I'm still on the council of. And it is the Association of American Playwrights, Librettists, as we don't like to be called, composers and lyricists. And it is almost a union. And the reason it's almost a union is because we own the copyright. It's our show. Producers do not own the copyright. We don't work for them. We lease them our show, and at the end of the production, we get it back. So they're only landlords, really, for the period of time that they are presenting it. You're very important. I mean, their entrepreneurship is very, very important. They're exploiting the show. You've written the show, and you're partners in a way.
You know, producing for me is about taking writers to lunch. and really getting behind writers, because the primary relationship, and why our industry is a little broken, our primary relationship is the producer and the author, because we are on the same side. We are all about building a stronger copyright and a better story together.
How soon do you begin thinking about a national tour for a show that hits?
As soon as possible.
As soon as they get a call from the booking agent. Sooner than it used to be. Often, producers are interviewing booking agents before the shows even come into New York. More often than not, in fact. The touring life of a Broadway show, that's often where a lot of the money is. So, I mean, I don't think anybody anymore comes in with the expectation, well, I'll just do Broadway, maybe I'll do the road. I mean, it's kind of a package deal, or you hope it to be.
You plan for success, and success includes a distribution beyond New York.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, it isn't crucial to hire the booking agent before you've done your Broadway show, but you want,
I agree.
but you want to be prepared
Writing it.
for whatever it
When the
is.
first song is written, when the first note, start with C. We're going to start the show with the letters, with the note C. Little C.
Begin in California.
The idea that we're a Broadway show is really not the point of being in Vegas. What being in Vegas is about entertainment and people who are looking to be separated from their money 24/7 and in the process being entertained for doing that and feeling they got great value. So that's what's happening. And as the Cirque shows are hundreds and $200 million extravaganzas, the idea of having shows that happen to be on Broadway and are popular and are funny and are entertaining, the threshold of entry for Vegas, it's a very reasonable business model, and for the shows from the theater producer standpoint, it's a bonanza.
You know, when we started in this business 20 years ago, we were doing off-Broadway, but, and you know, you might get a national tour in addition to the show that you were doing in New York. Today, with, you know, the obvious London and Australia playoffs, there's also a lot of venues in Europe now that play these shows. We're beginning to produce in China and East Asia. Obviously, a number of these pieces have now been made into movies or about to be made into movies.
If you really want to credit the person or people that created this model, you probably have to go back to Cameron McIntosh and Andrew Lloyd Webber, because they had, with the, quote, mega musicals of the 80s, the Phantoms, Cats, Les Mis, Saigon, they did that. They globalized the theater business. They created event musicals that had the capacity not just to be successful in one venue, but to have replica productions all over the world. And with that, they created the business model that American producers had not really yet taken advantage of. So when Disney did follow that path with Beauty and Lion King, that was our model. There's no question about it. But I think to properly say who created that model, you probably have to go back to the Cameron Andrew world and say they created the modern theater business. I can tell you this, that if theater was really about mounting a show on Broadway and having a national tour, Disney would not be in that business. That's just not it doesn't move the needle. So as much as Michael loved Broadway, the business of Disney is a global business, Disney Theatrical, and that was created, as I said, I think, by Cameron and Andrew.
If you have a hit, it becomes so much more exponential growth than you ever have in any other deal that I've ever seen. When you invest on a Broadway show, if you're investing in the originating production, meaning it hasn't like been done in London first or somewhere else first, but you're investing in that initial originating production on Broadway, you then, again, this is a generality, but you usually have the opportunity to, well, first you get all other productions of that show that get done subsequently pay a royalty into that initial originating company. That's number one. And then number two, you get the opportunity to invest your same pro rata share in additional productions. So let's say you had invested in the original production of Hamilton, as an example, on Broadway. There are now 6 other productions of Hamilton. There's 2 U.S. tours. There's about to be a third one. There's a production in Chicago that's a sit down. There's a production in London, and there's Broadway. So there's 6 productions. Mm-hmm. All 5 of those productions pay into the one production a royalty. Plus, you would have the ability to have invested your same amount in all of those. So instead of just being invested in one thing, you can basically roll over from profits that you're getting from the initial production into many subsequent productions. And that's where there's this exponential growth factor that can happen, which can be pretty amazing.
So how much, for my listeners, how much is that return for a very good show? A typical return, let's say.
A typical return. So let's say you have a show that's a huge hit, whether that's Wicked or Phantom of the Opera, which has been running for 30 some odd years. I mean, thousands of a percent return on your investment.
Thousands of percent? Wow.
Literally thousands of percent.
obviously one of the first things is a budget, yes?
That's true, and hopefully early on. I've done many shows where the producer has hired his entire creative team. They've already thought the show through, and then he comes and says, okay, I want it to cost X. You sort of go, you want it to cost X. Sometimes you work it out, sometimes you don't. But if a sane producer comes to you, the first thing you do is the budget, and you get from him his vision, if he has one. If not, then you meet with any of the creative team that he's hired to get their vision. And you sit down, you work it out, you tell him what it costs, and you really negotiate with the producer. He'll say, wait, that's way too much. You explain to him where the expense is so that he can then determine if he wants to decrease a portion of the budget. Is he willing to have less scenery? Is he willing to have less musicians on stage, depending on what the area is and what the problem is?
I mean, obviously the production budget is getting the show built, getting it rehearsed, getting it teched in the theater, getting it to the first time that the curtain goes up and there's an audience there. But then another responsibility you have is to tell the producers, okay, it's going to cost you this amount of money every week to run this show. What, I mean, when do you make that budget, and what influences that budget, separate and apart from the production budget?
That budget is also made at the same time you make the production budget, although it is probably revised 2 or 3 times as you go along and know more.
You know, a budget is made, and it's an arbitrary figure that you make up, and it's not exactly what you, this is an estimate. So with some of the producers or the people or the theater, the costume designers or the set designers, they see a budget and they say they have $500,000 for the set. Well, then they go out of their way to spend the $500,000 instead of going out of their way to bring that same set to look this way to come in at $150,000 or $200,000. And it's a thinking that they feel they have to buy fabric, silk fabric from Paris as opposed to buying it from some jobber on 41st Street. And which is just as good, and in the first row can't tell the difference. And it's an ego trip that a lot of people are on in this business, and they want to spend as much money as they can so they can say we have a $5 million musical, and that $5 million musical is supposed to be better than a $2 million musical, and it isn't.
We were talking about this. You can, I said to Gene, maybe you heard it, you could build a terrific house for $600,000 someplace.
You can build 3 of them.
Well, okay, I said
and
a
they
terrific
last.
house.
We build them to knock them down in one. We can knock them down in one
and
day.
they all get burned in New Jersey.
Right.
And when Spamalot is $15 million?
11.
11, sorry.
What's the difference?
Where is the $11 million? Where, I mean, people, I mean, on tickets, I know, and I know, you know, 1952, they said it was expensive too, but how does that $11 million get broken down, roughly?
Try out in Chicago for one, which is always an expensive proposition.
Yeah,
We did it on the producers.
Here's how it goes. $3.5 million for the physical production.
Physical production, sets,
$1 million
costumes.
to $2 million to put the physical production in the theater and conduct previews and work calls during the period when you're getting the show right. $1 million to $1.5 million in advertising. $2 million for an out-of-town that you might mitigate with income from the out-of-town. And the balance is largely in rehearsal costs and you know, administrative overhead. Creative fees and stuff like that. But to me, the thing that's really ratcheted up is the cost of putting the show in the theater. That's
the load-in
now absolutely absurd.
Based on theater costs, based on technology, based on what?
Based on
labor
stagehands.
costs. Yes, stagehands.
Stagehands get the most of everyone. If you want to make money, that's the job to get.
But don't you have to be born into a certain
Yes.
number of families? Okay, we'll just leave that.
It's all people. This business is nothing but people. I mean, the amount of material in a show is pretty limited. It's all people costs, and people have to, you know, get raises.
It's people costs without efficiencies. You know, we have issues and we've wrestled with this for a long time, and given the cost of everything, the idea of we're in a situation, and none of us here are anti-union. We have great respect for everybody who works in the theater because, again, there's easier places to work. But I think all of us are anti-inefficiency, or anti, yeah, that's right there. In that we have issues where you can't refresh crews, you know, when it's safer if you could, and you know, hours in the theaters are defined by certain times of the day and different categories of work, which just means you have to put more people in the theater. And once you get more people in the theater, it becomes inefficient because you're running into each other because you can't do everything at the same time. But
different union will have
but
different
they all
time.
have to show up for a load. When a load-in is called, a load-in is called, and everybody is there. And it's an inefficient use of manpower. And all the people who work in the theater are dedicated and great people. But we have to we owe it to ourselves as a community to really get honest with ourselves about how we trip over ourselves when we're trying to create theater. And it's a metaphor, but it's also literal. We actually do trip over each other when we're trying to do it all at once because the rule says that everybody has to show up. So you just say, you don't have to do that, wait a few hours, have some more coffee, and then you'll do it. But we're paying top dollar, and we're going into double time and triple time when we don't have to.
You have a situation where the producers' organization is very powerfully comprised not only of producers but of theater owners. And people of real estate have an even stronger aversion to Broadway being shut down. And it could be argued that while inflation has driven up prices during the period, that the cost of theater has gone up 2.5 times inflation in the past 25 years, and that 2.5 times inflation has a lot to do with signing off to unions in the theater, perhaps not standing up to some of the unions as strongly as they might. And as a result, you have now a runaway cost situation, which is making Broadway production inordinately high.
In my other industry, which is the clothing industry, my father always told me never to be partners with the guy who owns the factory. And I think that what's happened here is over 50 years or 30 years of negotiations between a league of producers and theaters. I don't know how old that organization is, but it's not a league of producers and it's not a league of theater owners. It's a league of both, and they don't have the same interest. They don't have the same interest. No one seems to want to say that, but I guess someone like me who's new could say it. As long as the theater owner is negotiating with the union, and all he has to do is say to the producers, well, I'm getting my cost out of this, then there's no reason to fight with the union. And
they have nothing at stake.
And what's happened is over the years it's been built up and built up and built up. And
they're giving the store away.
The only way this could ever
is what
happen
they're
is if
doing.
there's givebacks by these unions.
We are a research and development business, whether it's not-for-profit or commercial. It's alchemy. And yet, the whole industry is structured like manufacturing. And so some of these deals are structured as if it's a hit when you don't even have a first draft.
I believe that there may come a point, every year our costs go up substantially. I believe there could come a point where the unions, or maybe it's management allowing the unions, we're all in this together, but the prices get such that we price ourselves right out of the business. And at that point, I don't know how long it will take, I think the unions will slowly go because nobody will have work and you will start over again. I don't know if that's going to happen in 3 years or 53 years.
Is Broadway in a self-destruct mode, or is it in a self-policing mode, or do we need a Lee Iacocca to come in and do something with the Broadway theater to make this work? It is scary.
You don't need Lee Iacocca.
You need a
Watergate.
You need a Watergate committee.
And just one last thing, I think because it's getting harder and harder, we get back to the creative side of things, which is could well tend to make producers more cautious, which means that they will go with more brand names, which means that we may not have as exciting work as we would like to have.
The capitalization for plays typically is between, I'd say conservatively, between $3 and $6 million, 6 being on the very high end of a play. Most plays are on Broadway are capitalized, I'd say much more on average between 2 and 4 million. A musical can range anywhere from, I'd say in recent years, of smaller musical, $8 million, all the way up to, I mean, there are some outliers that have been, Spider-Man being the most outrageous example of 75 million or somewhere up there. I don't know, it's crazy. But there are other shows that right now the typical capitalization for a musical is averaging around, I'd say on average, between 18 and 22 million.
If you have a very prominent director, that director will usually say that if I'm going to sign on to this project, particularly on a musical, where they're much more involved in working with the authors on figuring out how to tell the story, that director will be given a share of the author's subsidiary rights revenue in the future, of that author's revenue, not ownership, not approvals, but a share of that, and in return for that, the authors will have the right to use those elements. Now, the Dramatists Guild is unhappy about that encroachment as well, because there are so many directors seek that as soon as they sign on to a project, and if it's someone who has not necessarily proven that they make that kind of contribution, the Dramatists Guild doesn't like to give it to them. This is one of the sort of ongoing, really difficult issues between the Dramatists Guild and the Directors Union on that very point. There was one show I worked on where it was a very prominent English director who had clearly done this before, and I said, ordinarily in this country, someone like you would get this participation. He said, oh no, I couldn't ask for that. That would be inappropriate. I said, fine. The show's about to open on Broadway. I said to him, do you still feel you didn't make a contribution here? And he said, well, actually, maybe I did. I contacted the author's representatives. The author said, absolutely, and they gave it to him. They had no obligation. The show's about to open because he had earned it at that point.
I can tell you that we sent out 11,000 Form K-1s last year, which the K-1 form lists the investor name, address, ID number, and lots of pertinent information. So that's protected very carefully in our office. And that's just my share. There's others out there as well.
What is happening and where the corporate influence is interesting, and also is a reason why many things are getting funded that might otherwise take longer to get funded, is that when you are a commercial producer and you invent it from thin air, and there are some, I'm not talking about things that have specific underlying rights that already have obligations to those rights, but if you create something from scratch and with original characters, a corporation is very interested in investing not just for what happens on Broadway, but because when you are that initial producer in the live theater, there is an incredible bundle of rights that get activated. And many corporations are interested in investing, and they'll say, fine for Broadway, but you know what, we'd really love to have a first look at electronic media, or we'd love to be the person. A lot of these corporations will find a complementary relationship in what you're doing and what their core business is. And we're seeing that more and more. That gets exploited through the life once the project gets going. And a lot of producers take that money as a hedge against the future, and a lot of producers also find it offensive because they're saying, look, I'm taking risk, let's see what happens, and then I'll come to you if there's something we can do together. And it just varies on the personality of the producer and the kind of project. But that's where producers are very corporations that are producers have other agendas than just necessarily the Broadway production.
We have a big piece of investment from this new group out on the road called the Independent Producers Network, or IPN. And what that is just recently, with the road sort of changing its face as it has, a lot of markets are now owned by Clear Channel. And there are, however, about 40 independent presenters.
I think we should explain that Clear Channel Entertainment.
Clear Channel Entertainment, yes.
Well, yeah, they have some 150, almost 100 venues.
Venues,
right, throughout the United States
and all the
Europe.
radio, almost all the radio.
They're a huge entertainment
And they're now
conglomerate.
producers on the show as well.
Well, they came on as associate because, well, this was a sign of how much they loved the show. But at the time of La Jolla, when we were just sort of at the ground level of seeing where this money would come from, these independent presenters came out to La Jolla and said, this show would be great on the road. Our audiences, our subscription audiences, would love this. It has everything they're looking for: singing, dancing, great story, whatever. They went down their checklist, and so they came on board as one of our producing partners, an investment really only, to make sure that when Millie goes out on the road, it goes to their cities first. So that was a unique form of
I think this is the first time that they've invested at this level.
Yes,
and you're talking
totally.
about 40 theaters across the country, each putting in about $25,000, $50,000, you know, small amounts, and they for the chance to be a part of the show and for the chance to get it first on their season. And they realize that they can't just sit out there and expect product to come to them. They want to jump in and support a show and try to get that show out to their cities.
But Nina, that's serves you secondary as well, because once you're ready to put a touring show out, now that we've lost our sequence, let's jump ahead for a minute. You know you've got bookings there. When you've got bookings in those theaters, you know you've got a successful tour.
There's already 40 weeks booked.
Well,
for
more than that, a few weeks
right.
ago, Clear
Right.
Channel came to one of our previews and said, wow, this is fabulous. We want in on this too. And they came on as an associate producer for a smaller amount of money, and with the caveat that they now, we've worked out, you know, a deal where some of the 40 get it first and some of the Clear Channel, you know, then get it tour. So we basically have now a 2-year tour.
One company. You didn't, I wondered if you had to go into a second company right away in order to accommodate both of those large venue groups.
You mean IPN and?
Yeah, and
no, well, we're talking about one tour at the moment.
Nina's 31.
I wanted to first ask you if either of you two had any nostalgia ever for the days when it was one name above the title, the David Merrick Harold Prince Presents sorts of days. You now obviously collaborate with 15, 16, 20, 30 producers.
But it's different because, for instance, if I find a property and I discover it, I could call Daryl and say, Daryl, I found this property. Do you want to be a partner? So we would be the general partners, and we would engage co-producers to help us raise the money. But we would be kind of the spearheads of a particular play.
Another reason, though, that producing has become so outrageously full of names above the title is because there are a lot of people now who are, in truth, angels or investors, but they would like to be billed as producers. And so they're, you know, they'll say to you, well, I'll invest in your show, but I want to have producer billing. Okay. The job of the producer is to raise the money. That's the only way it's going to come to fruition. And so many producers will say, okay, fine. And look, part of that's good because it brings more people into the industry, and I have no problem with that. The more the merrier. And raising money, especially in these times, is quite difficult. So it's fair to say that that has to be the way things are going.
What are the terms when a producer comes to rent a theater? Is that what it's called?
Yes,
he rents it from you?
He comes to negotiate a booking agreement.
And well, how is that decided, what the rental fee is?
Well, it's, again, a large part of supply and demand. Large part.
Oh, so it's flexible?
Flexible.
Oh.
One time the rent could be
Well,
higher than another.
Well, give me some idea, what in New York, say?
Well, I think it would be unfair to give you any idea, Pia, because it could, you know, the range could be so, and the swing could be so widespread that to give you a number would probably just confuse people. But basically it's done as a percentage of the gross.
Oh,
so that the theater operator provides the theater and some personnel, not all the personnel, but some personnel. And then that cost becomes the obligation or the responsibility of the producer. When they rent the theater, they agree to pay those people. Now, as a rent factor, or as a theater's share, as we call it, the theater's share is a percentage of the gross. And that could be any percent. I mean, which is, as I say, would be probably unfair and not the kind of thing that should be sent out on anything that's as durable as videotape.
Also, I guess it changes depending on the
exactly.
economy.
By the time we leave here, it may have changed.
May have changed, exactly.
I have to tell you, Jimmy Niederlander was the smartest man I ever worked with or for. And Jimmy's brilliance was that he never let you know how smart he was. Of course, we were around him all the time, knew. And I remember he had a very distinctive accent, if you recall, and he called me Nugget rather than Nugent. Hey, Nugget, he would say. And he taught me on day one that the house has the edge. And it's all about real estate. So the second I understood the legitimate theater on Broadway was all about real estate, I thought I was ahead of the gang. And I really was, because that's exactly what it is. It's a real estate game.
It's supply and demand. If there are a lot of empty theaters and not enough plays, obviously you can be much less choosy. If there are a lot of plays and the same limited number of theaters, because we are limited. There are about 35 theaters in New York City, so there is a limitation to the number of Broadway theaters. And when the number of plays and musicals exceed that number, and some people are waiting to come in, one then becomes not necessarily choosy. No one serves as a critic, no one serves as a censorer. But what you do is you think, you pick what you think will give you the best opportunity for a long run, because that's the kind of business you're in.
Well,
obviously your tenant has to be successful, otherwise your building is going to be vacated.
So you're looking for the hit.
The hit or the show that can run.
What do you think are the major issues that face theater producers as you plan to produce Broadway shows into the future?
I only have one.
What is it?
Real estate. It's harder than ever.
Yeah.
It's harder to
quite
get a
right, yeah.
theater. It's harder to make a
Absolutely.
deal, and the deals are getting harder.
We do have a lot of long-running musicals that really, I mean, some people would say clog up some of our theaters, but those investors, they have a right to make as much money as they can from their shows. What is worrisome now is with the advent of premium ticket pricing, what has become the norm or the news, as you referred to from last week, of $1.5, $1.6, $1.8 million grosses. So a show that might be doing 90% of capacity but not pulling in a lot of premium tickets, doing $750 or $800, is almost seen as a loser show, which is kind of bad when we say that a show that is doing like 80% of capacity but selling normal price tickets isn't like up in the top 10 or 20 shows. So that's kind of a worrisome development, because I think Broadway should be a place where all types of people can come and see all different types of shows. But if we are looking for shows that are grossing in the 1.5, 1.6 area, you obviously are looking for musicals or plays with stars.
I think the biggest problem plaguing our business is what number we break even at each week. So, you know, the landlords don't have much patience for shows that are marginal. So you really have to make it. It's feast or famine.
And unfortunately, there's going to be very little room for the medium successful shows, and the ones that are going to profit are the theater owners, because they'll move us in and they'll move us out, and they'll always have something on stage.
When you go into Broadway, do you already see your national tour in place? Is that taken into consideration right from the very beginning of what will tour and how you can tour it?
Well, for us, clearly the answer is yes.
Bear in mind that
For me, always yes, because what has to be fed out there are these regional theaters, which is a big, big, huge business. And it's like a whale eating plankton. They need product. And they don't get a lot of that out of New York, because you have to do family shows. Every show I've done, Will Rogers Follies is family, Pimpernela's family, this is family. You can bring your kids, your grandmother, whoever, and that is what will breed huge success in theater.
From the licensing perspective, the national tour is the best marketing tool that we as a licensing company have. Not just the Broadway production, but then it moves into all those individualized markets and all the marketing dollars that get put out behind it. Because we firmly believe that the best way to sell a show is for somebody actually to see the show, right? Everybody is a producer, okay? Even all the way down to your local high school theater teacher. They are the producer of that show at the high school. And there's one rule of producing that I firmly stand behind, is that everybody walks into a show and says, oh my gosh, that was amazing. But when I do it, that's the key to licensing, because that gives people the creative impetus to say, oh my gosh, I can't wait to put my own kind of creative stamp and my own creativity behind this story, behind the book, music, and lyrics of this particular musical. So the national tour thereby gets more people in the door to say, yeah, but when I do it. And we try to help that. When a tour goes out, we actually work with the tour producers to try to use our licensees, whether it's the community theater artistic directors or the local high school teachers, to get them in and partner and get them tickets so they can get into those seats and be exposed to that show.
Broadway and the road are such a different economic model, in that, an average Broadway show now is going to cost, a musical of substance and size is going to cost $15 million to produce. We're much less than that. An equity show right now costs about $4 million for us to put that out. And I'm talking about, a bigger musical with a big physical production.
Show actually has enough success on Broadway, the producer is eager to be able to distribute it across the country, and that's, not to make it secondary, but it is the next step, if you will. And they call on the general manager to try to find a way to organize it financially that it can make sense, so that our colleagues, the bookers, Meredith and Steve, could actually sell it to a presenter, which would be the same as Colleen and Michael. And the presenters are the presenters are the customer here. Ultimately, the real customer is the consumer. So, if the popularity isn't there, then they're not going to be able to justify buying it for a certain price, because, the show is going to be priced at a certain amount of money. I have an obligation to my client, who's the producer, to be able to make sure enough income is there to make not only what our weekly operating cost is, but enough to actually be able to pay back the startup costs.
In terms of a critical mass of the number of stops the tour needs to make it viable, is there a sort of...
That's changed too.
Is it? Yeah.
Minimum. Used to be 40 weeks.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking it's more like 50.
Yeah. If you have to start capitalizing from the first week. If you've had it, some tours I've worked on were capitalized. The Broadway rolled over to London, rolled over to the tour, so it all kind of the money all flowed.
Right, but it's its own animal. It
That's
generally,
right.
yeah.
But if you're starting up from scratch,
but tours are also lasting a little bit longer too. There are frankly more full-week subscription markets than there used to be.
Right.
New performing arts centers have been built, and some markets have gone to longer subscriptions. So, a 60, 65-week tour for a non-blockbuster is kind of almost becoming the norm.
Right. How profitable is a tour going on the road?
Profitable?
You don't go out and you don't. Let me explain that. He may be modest. You won't take the tour out unless you know that it's going to be profitable. That's the way they're structured today. And Pace, having most of the venues, has great control over that.
Yeah.
There are more theaters every week. The gross on the road is in excess of the gross on Broadway. Sometimes there's a narrow sight of things, but the real sales are around the country, not just on Broadway. It used to be, till Pace got very active in this, it used to be, correct me if I'm wrong, that people waited until it was a success on Broadway and then sent out around the country. Now they found out that Jekyll and Hyde toured before Broadway. Right, exactly.
So it's absolutely a business that is contemplated simultaneously.
Yeah.
In fact, there are some set pieces that were in New Haven that are part of the touring set, which will go out in January.
If it doesn't have that kind of touring potential, there's no point in doing it. You'll never make money on Broadway unless it's some kind of fantastic hit.
You want to go back to why you don't make money on Broadway?
Well, because the cost of doing the shows is so excessive, in some cases $10 and $12 million, and the arithmetic of capacity, 8 shows a week, and you fill all of those seats, it still takes you an awful long time to ever recoup your money. The money is all out on the road. On the road, when you said you're guaranteed, Pace, who owns theaters, they have subscription houses all over the United States. So you'll get let's say your show is $275. They'll guarantee you $300,000. So right away you're not going to lose. But you're all in there at 60% and 70% and so on and so on. And you get into these big houses, you know, you can make $1 million a week. You can't do that in Broadway. And you can keep repeating it over a 2 and 3 and 4 year period of touring. And that's before you go to Europe. So all the money's out there. And that's why.
Yeah, I think you're going to have everybody rushing into the theater being producers when you tell them they can make $1 million a week.
Well, they can. They can. I've been through that. I mean, Will Rogers Follies won what, 7 Tony Awards for the best musical and all that, and we broke even after sitting here for 2.5 years. Went out on the road, and we did make $1 million a week.
I know that there's a quite current fracas going on about non-equity tours, which certainly, you know, if you read everything about it, it would indicate that something's wrong, but I don't know what it is that's wrong. But there's a whole industry of non-equity tours. They're not non-union tours. They're just non-equity tours.
And they're getting less and less, and they're getting more and more. Some of the producers who've done non-equity for years are now starting to make equity agreements that are lesser than this agreement. And some are new non-equity are coming through. I don't know what trend that will have for us. And those are things that we as managers don't really decide. I mean, if you can decide whether or not you want to do a non-union tour. I don't do them because I don't know them. It's a whole different business.
a guarantee sum is paid from the presenter to the producer, and the producer or general manager like Alan would add up all those monies and say, okay, there's enough of that to pay the initial startup costs, and so we have a tour. Enough to pay in the fee to pay the startup costs, a share of the startup costs, and the weekly operating.
Average guarantee for a big Broadway show these days?
These days?
Yeah.
I think more often than not above the 300 mark. So we're probably like a lot of them are in the 325 range right now. But again, interestingly enough, if you look back 10 years ago, that's about what they were then too.
Yeah, it might not be the guarantees have gone up significantly, but now we have something called a variable guarantee that used to try to hide under something called royalty, and now you get 70 instead of 60%. So tell me what the company share looks like versus the old company share. And when you start looking at company share, I think you see that's where the growth has been. If a show is getting a $300,000 guarantee and there's a 10% variable guarantee, the guarantee just became $400,000 if you gross $1 million. Yeah, so it might say 300 on the contract, but it's really 400, and then they get their percentage afterwards. So, but we all know that.
I think one of the problems with the theater and why some of these operating expenses got so high and they weren't concerned about the bottom line of the investors making money is people got greedy in the theater, and certainly not you, but there are producers out there that are living living off the money from the theater or from the show, whether the show made a profit or not. They weren't as concerned. We have a lot more concern about that, and Ron made a great point about the theaters in England being able to run. I would feel terrible for anybody who likes a theater who didn't get a chance to see this show or a lot of other good shows. And because of the greed of some producers, or well, I'll use the word producers mainly, of milking a company, just like any other business or any other company where the owners of a company, you look at a balance sheet and you see that the company has no net worth, yet you see the owner's riding around in a Rolls Royce and he's living in a house in Scarsdale and they're living like a king, but the company has no value. Well, that's what's happening to a lot of shows, and that's the reason some shows couldn't remain open and sustain mixed reviews. And we really, this producing team has not taken a dime for themselves, and they've run that show. This show is being run for the show, for the investors, and for the cast, for everybody that put in their I don't know about this on TV, but their guts into the show.
Right.
Because they deserve to have a show run. We put in 9 months of work, and Ben Vereen and everybody in the cast and Hal Prince have put 2.5 years in the show to get it to this point. And it'd be a shame because of a few critics not being their cup of tea to have the show closed before it had a chance to live.
Yes.
The deal that we have with the Broadway League is that that information is reviewed by staff to ensure that it's correct and that our members are compensated properly, but we're not able to share the specifics of it.
It's better now, but hasn't been great for several years, is the complexity of royalty pools and amortization and the ignorance on behalf of so many people. And I don't use ignorance in a pejorative sense, just not knowing what these things are. And general managers and producers who are smart about it manipulating all the numbers and making the numbers for their benefit, and then showing these formulae and other things to agents and others who are mystified by it. They don't understand it. They need to use their lawyers and other people to figure it out.
Well, every show that goes out has some sort of recoupment schedule. This isn't something that's publicized anywhere, but it's when any producer is planning out a show, they have to know what the financial outlook of this show is anticipated to be. And then sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. But it's part of understanding of why this tour is, financially beneficial to go out, and that it will make some sort of profit, or it's not anticipated to make some profit, and what could they do to help it make a profit, things like that.
You won't take the tour out unless you know that it's going to be profitable. That's the way they're structured today.
So there's always a plan to go out, and we typically know about it. They are not required to share with us their recoupment schedule, but typically they'll talk to us about it.
The production budget is a separate piece of information that goes into what the expected expenses are each week for the tour.
I mean, obviously the production budget is getting the show built, getting it rehearsed, getting it teched in the theater, getting it to the first time that the curtain goes up and there's an audience there.
What is PACE?
What is PACE?
Mm-hmm.
PACE produces new intellectual properties on Broadway, such as Jekyll and Hyde. We're the lead producer of that, and The Who's Tommy several years back. We produce revivals on Broadway. We produce national touring companies that play throughout the United States. We operate Broadway subscription series in 38 markets in North America. We have some real estate interests both in the United States and in England. And we're part of a larger live entertainment company called SFX, which is a publicly traded company on NASDAQ, which does everything from rock concerts to motorsports events.
There are thousands of community theaters from coast to coast, really thousands, and people go all the time. You know, my brother is out in South Dakota, and he sends me all the theater news, and it's enormous what they have out there. From all the small towns, he sends me clippings, and they're doing all the shows that were done 2 years ago on Broadway, you know. And they're done by these local companies, the community theaters. But they're countless, and there is an enormous interest in theater.
The traditional, I call it trickle-down economics. Broadway into licensing and moves into the regional theaters in a traditional trickle-down economics model, whereas the Broadway production continues to run, it sends out its tour, and at that point in time, the show is fully restricted for licensing for the 1,800 or so professional theaters across North America. The 7,000 community theaters, the 50,000 high schools. Once the Broadway show wraps up, The tour begins to wind down. Those restrictions start getting lifted in certain markets, and every regional theater is waiting to be the first one in their particular market to license that next version of the show, the non-replica version of the show. So in the case of something we were waiting for a long time was White Christmas. When that finally was released, we were the first in the position in Northeast Ohio to be able to license that production. Part of its relationships and building a relationship with the licensing companies. And then also a part of it is the value of your organization, the amount of revenue that you're going to bring to the authors and to the underlying rights holders.
Remember Seussical, the musical? We felt that young children would gain so much from that show. Well, the show failed, but guess what? It is the most licensed production in amateur theater, maybe in history. And the money keeps flowing in. It's been coming in for years and years and years.
That's why you're a great accountant, because you can take one and make it two. Just like that.
I can take it and make it 3 if you want. 1 + 1 can be anything you want it to be.